A little more than a week since the attempted coup d'etat by the Venezuelan opposition, obviously supported by the United States, there have been a number of international declarations which show the geopolitical interest in Venezuela. The international media present it as a sort of new edition of the Cold War. So we ask, what is the analysis from all these declarations and diplomatic moves after this attempted coup d'etat in Venezuela on the 30th of April? Is Venezuela the scene of a confrontation between Russia and the United States, similar to the Cold War? On the other hand, are the sanctions a military strategy with direct consequences on the population? Is military intervention still an option? Is there time for political negotiations and distension? Venezuela evading the war hawks. That's the topic in today's Critical Moves. Welcome. We'll look at the latest facts and the actors behind them. We begin. So our first move, President Nicolas Maduro alerted that the Colombian government had announced a false incursion of a Venezuelan military unit on Colombian territory with the objective of creating conditions for a military escalation on the border. This is a new false flag operation to present Venezuela as an aggressive country responsible for violence, which historically has originated in their territory. That's what the Foreign Minister Jorge Arias said on Twitter, and he said that the aggressions against Venezuela are public and well known, and that the Colombian authorities should stop their hostility and stop distracting their public opinion from the grave problems and try to use Venezuela as an excuse. Look what's happening in Colombia. We need to be on the alert. A series of false flag operations in recent days. They had these false flag operations, and the head of the Colombian armed forces accused Venezuela of having 1,000 Colombian guerrillas on its territory. No, sir. That's not. You are the ones who have the problem. You have a war that's been going on for 60 years. You haven't wanted to make peace. When you did sign the peace agreement with the FARC, you started killing FARC members. So don't accuse Venezuela of your own war. It's a war in Colombia between paramilitaries, guerrillas, a whole series of forces, and you're accusing us. The objective is clear. We want the Iranians out, we want the Russians to go away, we want the Cubans leave. That's, in the last instance, what has to happen so we can re-establish democracy in Venezuela. It's very clear. I don't think there's anything the President says that's incompatible with that. I came here to be very clear. The United States will continue using all diplomatic pressure and economic pressure to achieve a democratic, peaceful democratic transition in Venezuela. But those who continue oppressing the good people of Venezuela should know this. All the options are on the table. We are prepared for any scene. First, our hands are open for peace, for diplomacy, to talk to everyone in the world. I said that yesterday the President of the Supreme Court, Michael Moreno, responded to the declarations by Mike Pence in this way. We denounce, condemn before the country and the international community that the United States are trying, with this ultimatum, that the judicial power in Venezuela should not act democratically and promote a coup d'etat. So let's look at a summary of the actions against Venezuela, against its institutions and its legitimate government. The Bolivarian Revolution, founded by Commander Hugo Chavez and now led by President Nicolas Maduro, has suffered numerous aggressions from the United States and harassment by the opposition financed by the empire. They've tried to overthrow the Bolivarian Revolution. They've tried assassinations, economic blockades, sabotage of the electrical system, and the use of regional bodies like the OAS. This year, the United States has stepped up its unconventional war against Venezuela in order to take over its natural resources. They promoted Juan Guaidó as the self-proclaimed president. Guaidó has seen a series of failures in his attempts to mount a coup, always supported by Washington and by Latin American allies, calling for military intervention. The attempted coup on the 30th of April saw Leopoldo López back on the scene after escaping from his house arrest. He's a fugitive from justice. He's now taking refuge in the Spanish embassy in Venezuela after leaving the Chilean embassy. The threats of military intervention have resulted in a lot of diplomatic activity. The insistence of the United States in attacking Venezuela has drawn reactions from Russia, China, and many Latin American countries. So, let's go to the Russian news agency Sputnik. On the 30th of April, just hours after the coup, they talked about an opposition demonstration in Caracas. The right is seeking military intervention by the United States in Venezuela. They interviewed the Argentinian politician Oscar Laborde from the Front for Victory. He said that the attempted coup d'etat on the 30th of April showed desperation and showed effectively Guaido has not managed, nobody now takes his proposals seriously. He's become a rather sad character, a minor character with big pretensions to be president, although nobody's ever voted for him. So let's go now to Grey Zone, which published on the 6th of May an article by Ben Norton, which says false news. CNN has falsely accused that the coup leader in Venezuela was elected. And let's look at the content. On the 5th of May, CNN published an article called "A military helicopter crashed in Venezuela, killing 7 people in the midst of protests." And in that article, it says that the helicopter accident came as pressure is stepping up on Maduro to resign after the elections in January, in which voters elected the opposition leader Juan Guaidó instead of him as president. That, of course, is a complete fiction. There were no elections in Venezuela in January. Voters never voted for elected, much less elected Juan Guaidó. That is a fabrication. There was no public apology for this false news, written by John Bona and Jackie Castillo, with other 4 reporters supporting them. So now to Mission Verdad, Truth, which has this article, The Rise and Fall of the Myth of Leopoldo López. published on the 8th of May.
Después de una descripción muy detallada de los hechos y sobre todo de los orígenes de Leopoldo López,
it talks about his background,
como primer
and it
punto,
says
esto que vemos en pantalla, la falta de apoyo
the
social
lack of
alrededor
social
de la figura de
support for Leopoldo
no solo
Lopez
implica el
doesn't
derrumbamiento
only
del mito
mean the
político,
collapse
sino
of
la
a political
ausencia de una
myth,
figura
but also the
sólida
absence
dentro
of
de la
a
élite
solid
dominante
figure
para que
in the
Estados Unidos gestione el
dominant
reordenamiento
elite
político y
for the
económico de
United States
Venezuela,
to
estableciendo
reorganize the
un
political and
consenso
economic
social
scene in
permanente.
Venezuela.
Y esto trae como consecuencia, a juicio de Augusto Márquez,
This has
que la
the
injerencia
consequence
sea mucho
that
más directa. Segundo tópico, el
interference will be
viraje
more
generado por
direct.
Chávez fue profundo al punto
The
tal que
turn
amplios sectores de la
made by
población
Chavez was
resisten
profound,
a la seducción
and
de
that's
una
why
figura
broad
icónica de la
sections of
clase
the
dominante que es
population, of the
proyectada
Venezuelan
desde el modelo
population,
hacia
resist
Visto esto a escala
any
regional,
figure
significa que el país político
of
marcha en
the
dirección contraria
ruling
a esas
class,
tendencias
projected as a model to
en las
follow,
cuales la palabra de la élite blanca y millonaria decide el
and
destino
where
político.
the
Y
white
finalmente,
and
corto y
rich
conciso,
elite
y tiene
wants
algo de
to
conexión con lo
retake
que
their
mostrábamos de
destiny
Grey
in their
Zone
own hands.
o de Grey Zone, los medios mienten siempre. Ahí están esos 3 puntos conclusivos.
So,
Pueden
3
visitar
key
en su
points
verdad y
there.
leer todo el escrito completo. Nos actualizamos a esta hora y qué mejor que conectar con Caracas, Venezuela. Y
So let's go to our correspondent in Caracas, Madeleine Garcia. Good evening.
Bueno, Madeleine, ahí
So,
últimas
Madeleine,
declaraciones que
the latest
son
declarations
realmente contundentes y que dejan traslucir
which
una
are
vez más la
quite
postura
significant.
gubernamental. El presidente decía ayer,
The
se
President said
prepara desde Colombia
yesterday
un falso
that
positivo. Por allí
false
nos
flag
centrábamos en
operations
nuestra
are being
jugada.
prepared from
Así
Colombia.
es. Todo esto,
That's right.
hay
All
que
this
decirlo, está en el contexto de
comes in the
lo
context
que ha venido ocurriendo desde el 30
what's been
de
happening
abril,
since
un
the
golpe
30th
de
of
Estado
April with that
en
attempted coup
desarrollo
d'etat,
que logró frustrarse ese
which
mismo
was
día,
frustrated,
pero que tuvo
blocked,
sus secuelas posteriormente.
but has
Y
had a
esto
series of
implica
consequences,
acciones desde los países
which
aliados a
involves
Estados Unidos y los países que apoyan a la
actions
oposición
by
venezolana. En este caso,
countries who are allied to the United States and who support the Venezuelan opposition, including Colombia, which Venezuela says is, which said that Venezuelan soldiers had entered Colombian territory, that it Venezuela supports the guerrillas, Colombian guerrillas inside Venezuela. And of course, the president pointed out that there's a war in Colombia for the last 6 decades.
Queremos recordarlo, iniciaron desde el propio 23 de febrero cuando se
And of course, since the 23rd of February, when they tried to push so-called humanitarian aid across the border, and we saw some early fake news then, when 2 armored cars of the National Guard, you may remember, were stolen, ran over some people who were on the Simón Bolívar bridge on the border,
la frontera por parte del gobierno colombiano y luego el gobierno venezolano hizo lo propio y que intentaba verse como una agresión de Venezuela.
and it was initially presented as an aggression by Venezuela against Colombia. That, of course, became clear because we had reported we were there, and there has been a series of acts since then.
Justamente en el distribuidor Altamira.
On the 30th of April, on the Altamira Junction, this group of soldiers, led by Juan Guaidó and Leopoldo López, that was the surprise of the day because he was under house arrest.
Se fugó y apareció
He escaped and appeared there. And on that bridge, there were not only those soldiers and those 2 politicians, but a whole number of members of the National Assembly, opposition members of the National Assembly, turned up to support that coup d'etat. What they said was the last phase of Operation Freedom, as they call it.
Le llamaron de esta manera Operación Libertad y dijeron nada, este día se
and
acaba
they said
el presidente Nicolás Maduro.
that day President Nicolás Maduro would end his time in office. The plan, the counterintelligence, discovered that the director of SEBIN, the intelligence service, was himself involved in this plot, Manuel Christopher Figuera, and he was promptly released of the sanctions which the United States had imposed on him. And this shows that those sanctions are political. They're a political measure It's not exactly about corruption and so-called and drug trafficking as they allege, but it means to put pressure on the military. And he was one of the leading characters in this failed coup d'etat. Then the public prosecutors have begun an investigation into 10 members of the National Assembly who appeared on that bridge, the Altamira Junction Bridge, and supported the coup. That was absolutely public, so they were caught in the act, if you like. Then yesterday the Constituent Assembly lifted their parliamentary immunity, and the first vice president of the National Assembly, Edgar Zambrano, was arrested. So various international bodies have demanded his release, but this shows that the situation in Colombia, along with all these other facts, are part of this context. And the Supreme Court and the government have reacted to these threats from the United States, saying that you cannot threaten them with further sanctions and major actions if they continue to so-called persecute these members of the National Assembly. So that's why President Nicolas Maduro alerted people to be on the alert against this continuing attempt at a coup d'etat. Thank you very much, Madeleine, for your very complete account of what's been going on and the magnitude of this conspiracy and what is still happening. So let's go to Washington and our correspondent Jorge Hestoso. Jorge, we've seen a lot of diplomatic moves, including the United States, of course. So what are we hearing there? Lucia, we've had 13 hours now since they cut the electricity at the embassy here in Washington to the activists who are protecting the Venezuelan embassy here in Washington. The pro-Guaido supporters have been trying to get in, and since they haven't managed to get in, they are carrying out the same kind of strategy that's being practiced against Venezuela. So this cutting off the electricity, the self-proclaimed ambassador of Venezuela here in Washington, the representative of the self-proclaimed president, Juan Guaido, on Twitter, after the electricity was cut off last night, said, "We have decided from this moment that they will not have any electricity. The next step is their exit from the embassy." But the interesting thing here, Lucia, is there is the Convention of Vienna, signed by the United States, signed by Venezuela in 1961, and I want to draw your attention to what's happening here, because in Chapter 20 of that Vienna Convention it says, and I read it, the inviolability of diplomatic premises which the security forces of the host country are not allowed to enter, and the host country is obliged to protect the premises against any invasion or damage and to avoid any disturbance of the peace in the diplomatic mission. I read this because if we read this word by word, you can see the number of violations which are being carried out. Cutting off the electricity is one of them, but the fact that these demonstrators have decided to surround the embassy to stop people from going in or coming out, And what's more, they are trying to prevent that anyone takes food or medicines into those who are protecting the embassy. So as I said before, it's a similar strategy to try and strangle those inside, just as they're trying to do with Venezuela itself, with the whole blockade of the financial system. Here, they are trying to strangle the embassy itself with this cordon around the embassy. And the security here is supposedly under the responsibility of the local police. There are Secret Service people all over the place, and they are permitting that these opposition figures not only surround the building, not only and disturb the public peace here, they're trying to attack, making a lot of noise to upset the public order. So if this is clearly written down in the treaty, in the Vienna Convention, which the United States is obliged to protect this diplomatic building, the collective for the protection of the embassy, the activists who have been invited in by the Venezuelan government to protect the premises, and this is all happening in front of the whole world. They now still have no electricity, and they are trampling on the local government here, so that the protectors are filing appeals to the local authorities, to Congress itself, to re-establish the electricity supply. And in about 5 minutes, this collective will be giving a press conference to bring us up to date on what's happening. What you can hear behind us is the verbal aggression which these opposition demonstrations, so it's verbal, but it's also physical. And nobody is trying, the police are doing nothing to stop them. When people try to take food into the people protecting, the pro-Guaido protesters attack them directly, try to seize the food, to try and starve out those who are inside the embassy. And we should remember two important things. The United Nations, the only state recognized by the United Nations is the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela of President Nicolas Maduro. These Guaido protesters do not represent any state. On the other hand, they argue that there are 50 countries who have recognized the self-proclaimed Guaido. But we know very well that there's 193 countries, members of the United Nations. 150 of them, 120 of them, are totally, clearly, are organized in the non-aligned movement, and the president of that organization is none other than President Nicolas Maduro, who continues to be the president of the non-aligned movement. So the second biggest international organization after the United Nations itself is the non-aligned movement. It continues to have Nicolas Maduro as its president. So this is an example of how both local, national, international law is being made a joke of by these people, with the complicity of the local authorities. So this is what's going on. And at the press conference, to be given by the protectors of the embassy, so now that's started, and they're screaming and making a lot of noise to try and prevent anyone from listening to what is being said. Back to you, Lucia.
Hasta pronto. Allí teníamos a Jorge
So there we
de la
had
Embajada
Jorge
de Venezuela en
Gestoso from
Washington,
the
D.C.
Venezuelan
Y bueno, tenemos entonces que
embassy
profundizar con
in
nuestros analistas en las razones o en qué justifica esta asfixia en lo micro, en lo macro y en varios
So we
casos,
have to go into more
de forma
detail in
simultánea,
this
como,
at the
nos
micro
estaba
and
contando
macro
Madeleine y
level
Jorge Gestoso desde
in
Caracas y
terms of
Washington,
what
D.C.
both
respectivamente. Y
Madeleine
retomo yo
Garcia and
algunos
Jose
interrogantes
Gestoso.
que planteábamos
So
en
here
la
are some
editorial,
questions
conducentes a la profundización en el
to
próximo
go
segmento,
deeper
que
into this
determinan
in the
estos
next
últimos
block.
movimientos diplomáticos que se han dado a escala
What is
internacional
the
atinentes a Venezuela,
meaning of the
si acaso
diplomatic
elecciones
moves around
recientes
Venezuela
en el que
and in terms of the dispute
distintos
between
poderes
Russia and the United
opuestos del mundo
States?
están enfocándose para dirimir nudos críticos y principales contradicciones. Y
So,
si
what are the
acaso
contradictions
esto
involved
es
here?
o se reduce a una disputa Estados Unidos en Rusia como en otra hora. Lo vamos a ver,
We'll be
lo
looking at
vamos a
that
analizar,
in
se lo
more
consultamos a
detail
nuestros analistas, vamos
with
a
our
conversar con
analysts
ellos.
in
Primera
the next
pausa y ya
block.
volvemos.
We'll be right back.
Venezuela, esquiva y resistente ante los halcones de la
Venezuela
guerra.
evading the hawks of war. That's the topic of our critical moves today and what we're analyzing. Let's look at the Argentinian publication Página 12, this 9th of May, a cowboy on the Venezuelan plains. In an interview with the Spanish Foreign Minister, José Borrell, said that the United States are acting like a cowboy in Venezuela, in a bullying way. And he says that he is supporting negotiations as a way to go to elections, and we reject any kind of support for military interventions. And he also insisted that Leopoldo López cannot ask for asylum in Spain because he is not physically in Spain. So these recent diplomatic moves show that Venezuela is playing a big part in the Western Hemisphere now. The relations and contradictions pass through Venezuela, a country with, of course, huge oil reserves, and a priority for. At the beginning of the week, Sergei Lavrov, the Russian Foreign Minister, and the U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo met at the Arctic Council in Finland, and they talked about Venezuela. Lavrov was again firm in rejecting any sort of military intervention and said there was no country in the world who supports that. Pompeo apparently agreed with that, which seems to be a contradiction because in other scenarios he's talked about all the options being on the table. Venezuela was also the subject on a tense telephone conversation with Donald Trump. Again, there was a contradiction. Arriaza had a meeting with Lavrov in Moscow. The Russian diplomat gave support to Venezuela and said he condemned the U.S. campaign to overthrow the legitimate government of Nicolas Maduro. And there was also moves in the United Nations to protect Venezuela. The Russian support is fundamental to limit or prevent a U.S. military intervention, which has been permanently put on the table by the Trump administration. According to Lavrov, Pompeo will visit Russia in the first half of this month to continue talking about Venezuela.
Una publicación de hace 8 horas, Lavrov
So,
desmiente posibilidad de pacto entre Rusia y Estados Unidos referente a Venezuela. No habrá ningún convenio entre Rusia y Estados Unidos referente a Venezuela. Los pactos
Lavrov has told Sputnik that there is no agreement between the United States and Venezuela and the United States to deal with Venezuela. That was Sergei Lavrov, of course. So, let's analyze all this with our guests, Fernando Buenabad, philosopher and writer who's in Argentina, and Breno Altman, Brazilian journalist. Breno. So let's begin with Fernando. So, let's do the Breno then. How do you explain what is happening in and against Venezuela? Thank you for the invitation. Good afternoon to all of you. The United States continues with its escalating its aggression against Venezuela. There are many reasons that leads the United States in this direction. The permanent theme of oil, of its geopolitical interests against Russia and China in Latin America, the issue of its offensive against the left in Latin America, and the issue of the coming elections next year in the United States, and Trump's desire to win more support in the swing state of Florida, which is always, of course, a key state in U.S. elections. And with an ever more aggressive discourse against Venezuela, he's trying to build support. But the fact is, Trump is losing some of his arms against Venezuela. The wider operation is getting weaker. The isolation or opposition to a military option is very clear. Even many of the countries who have recognized Guaido are trying to distance themselves from this more aggressive policy by the United States. And in this kind of situation, where the Bolivarian Revolution is surviving, and the government of President Maduro maintains and broadens its domestic and international support, the U.S. is losing options. Its policies are losing space. They're trying to maneuver to get out of the situation without being demoralized or discredited in the face of Russia and China. They keep bringing the military option back onto the table, but fundamentally, in the months since the 23rd of January, is a scene where, with all the difficulties, the Bolivarian Revolution continues resisting, and the internal opposition has lost strength. So let's go to Fernando now. There have been many calls on the Bolivarian armed forces to support a change of regime. U.S. spokespeople, what kind of messages and sanctions are they using to criminalize the Chavista section of the population? Has this become an obsession of the White House? And what should we attribute that to? Good afternoon. Greetings to all of you. It seems to me that it's not simply caprice or madness. It's a plan that's designed in the context of an economic war undertaken against Venezuela, which involves various tasks for this kind of warfare, which Trump is leading. It's not just a provocation. The history of Venezuela, with its civilian military alliance, which is at the basis of the Bolivarian revolutionary process, this is a plan which includes, which has certain demands to create a current of international opinion to convince those people who are misinformed, who don't receive decent information about Venezuela, that its military forces are any military force that is corrupt. They're trying to make everyone believe this. This is part of the media strategy closing in on Venezuela to work alongside the military bases the US has around the world to consolidate the media bases. Yesterday, Trump supported Macri's election campaign in Argentina and said that Macri has all his support, and this means repositioning the strategies of intervention in electoral processes. We all know that Argentina has become a platform for media attacks on Venezuela. There have been systematic attacks, apart from the economic war, the media war. And we look at the scene across the continent, in Brazil, Peru. These attacks to try and undermine Venezuela and undermine its armed forces and undermine President Maduro and all his cabinet, all the institutions that support the Bolivarian Revolution. That's one of the key tasks. This goes hand in hand with the economic war to kidnap Venezuela's resources, to pillage Venezuela's reserves. It's very similar to what they did against Chile, against President Allende. It's similar to what they did against Libya, where war is not just about military or economic, but also about creating a current of international public opinion, which to make Venezuela appear like a violent, chaotic, defeated, weak country. And that's the front on which Venezuela is also giving a clear message. In this kind of situation, the huge efforts by, for example, the Foreign Minister Jorge Arreaza, meeting leaders all over the world to put forward the truth and to insist on dialogue, on talks. And it's clear that the last thing that Trump and his people want is dialogue and talks. They want to destroy a political project which is inconvenient and uncomfortable for them and prevents them from stealing Venezuela's oil as they always used to. Let's go back to Breno, Altman. There are various contradictions in the discourse and in the facts that the Pentagon, the White House, and others don't seem to be able to agree completely about their strategy. For example, around the issue of military intervention. Do you think that's the biggest risk to peace in the Western Hemisphere now? We have to remember that the United States have no certainty about military attack on Venezuela. Many senior military figures in the United States think this would be a huge risk. In the case of Colombia and Brazil, the governments of Ivan Duque and Jair Bolsonaro, are they prepared to get involved in a military adventure in Venezuela? What conditions, what strategies would such a military attack have? Are they going to try and occupy Venezuela by land and repeat a situation like Vietnam and impose an occupation force? Or would it be more like Yugoslavia, where they bombed the country to destroy its infrastructure and to provoke an internal crisis on the basis of destroying the economy? So what would be the form of a military attack on Venezuela? Many generals in the Pentagon have a lot of doubts about this option and think it's more of a bluff by Trump rather than a real possibility. Trump has difficulty to have a concrete plan in this sense. There's a lot of internal political and military resistance to anything of this sort. Of course, we shouldn't have illusions on the characteristics, the warlike intentions of the White House. U.S. imperialism throughout history has been ready to resort to violence, to trample on the self-determination of countries, to war and aggression when its interests do not fit with the autonomy and the will of those peoples. But the international support for this kind of attack doesn't exist. The US would have to carry out such an attack by itself. Even the OAS wouldn't support it because they can't get two-thirds of the votes in the OAS to recognize Guaidó. So the OAS can't serve as a front for a military intervention. It would be an isolated attack, a colonial-style attack, an attack in which the military conditions are not sure. They're threatening for the imperialist power itself. And many people are saying, many of the US generals are saying that to Trump, warning the White House that this is a very dangerous adventure. So let's end going back to Fernando Buenabad.
Diplomática en el respeto a los niveles nacionales e internacionales, está proponiendo una coalición de países dentro de Naciones Unidas contrapuesta.
Venezuela there's a proposal for a coalition of countries in the UN to oppose military intervention. As we said before, there's going to be that meeting in Moscow in the next few days. Do you think the political conditions exist? There's no will on the part of the United States and Donald Trump, particularly, to have some kind of negotiations. All the analyses of the lack of support that Trump would have to continue his aggression against Venezuela. I would add the domestic political scene in the United States. It's important because Trump, within his country, has a long list of political problems. Much of what he's doing in relation to Venezuela, for him, is about winning support in the business sectors or sections of the right and the far right in the United States. But within the United States, the way the Venezuelan people are suffering, within the rank and file of the people of the United States, there's not much support for continuing this kind of aggression against Venezuela. The political scene within the United States will give us a lot of clues to understand how far they can go. But I think that beyond the expectations of a dialogue, I think the only serious way of dissuading Trump is the political message from the peoples organizing in all ways to oppose. I think we have to repeat the calls that President Nicolas Maduro has made to the whole world, that all organizations of human rights, political organizations, and everybody who wants a dignified world, a world that isn't submitted to North American imperial power, should express their solidarity with Venezuela and should reject these serious violations of international agreements. For example, in the defense of embassies, we should have an international brigade coordinated by the United Nations, if it were the case, to protect the Venezuelan embassy in Washington and point out you cannot just trample on the Convention of Vienna. The whole world should re-establish respect for the institutions which is defended by these treaties, which makes, and there should be popular mobilizations everywhere, just as once there was a rejection of attacks on the Cuban embassy during the coup against Hugo Chavez. Now, the fact that in some people tried to break into the Spanish embassy, I think we should defend all those diplomatic premises that are protected by international agreements. But that doesn't depend only on political leaders. It depends on the social mobilization around the world. I think that's one of the most this is an important moment to repeat those calls for popular mobilization. The need for dialogue has to be supported by a world movement. That's the way to detain aggression, to stop aggression against Venezuela. Thank you very much to both of you, and it's been very important listening to your analysis. So in the next part of our analysis, so this network of solidarity organizations which Venezuela has tried to build up amongst different countries, can they provide an obstacle to U.S. aggression? And whether the economic measures against Venezuela are getting worse and more damaging. We'll be back. Welcome back. As we've shown before, there are many reasons why the United States is being so aggressive towards Venezuela. Political reasons, which have to do with the challenge which the Bolivarian Revolution created by Chavez and the Chavista movement to the U.S. hegemony. There are also economic issues. Sanctions have been a measure used by the United States to try and remove governments. In this case, Venezuela has challenged the hegemony of the dollar of the United States, and because it has rich natural resources. A key point of the Bolivarian government's policy has been the support that Nicolas Maduro has achieved around the world. The recent tour by Jorge Arreaza, the foreign minister, to countries of Europe, Middle East and Africa, shows the strengthening of a network of relations and solidarity, denouncing U.S. intervention in domestic affairs of Venezuela. He has also managed to win support within the United Nations. More than 140 countries recognize Nicolás Maduro as a legitimate president of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. The Foreign Minister Jorge Arreaza began this trip with a double objection to prevent U.S. intervention, but also to draw up economic agreements that now will allow Venezuela to overcome the severe sanctions and economic measures against Venezuela. Important agreements have been signed in Namibia, there were with Turkey, and in Syria. There are also 11 agreements with Russia on finances, oil, and other areas. At the same time, so let's go now to our guest in the studio, Pascualina Curcio, Venezuelan economist. Welcome. Thank you. Do you think the imbalance in economic terms are a consequence of the boycott and the measures taken by the United States against Venezuela? Without doubt, there are many factors, but the decisive one are these economic aggressions which have been applied against the people of Venezuela and which have got even stronger in the last few months. On the one hand, these unilateral coercive measures and illegal measures, because they violate international law, financial blockade, commercial blockade, and sanctions which are not against individuals but against the whole people. For example, affecting PDVSA, the company that generates 90% of foreign exchange earnings. This has an impact, some $20 billion of impact on the Venezuelan economy, including the stealing of the Citgo, the PDVSA subsidiary in the United States, the freezing of over $1 billion worth of reserves in the Bank of England. And with all this money and this income is what we use to import medicines. This amount amounts to something like 6 years' worth of medical imports. These are crimes against humanity because they affect systematically, and the White House spokespeople continue to say they will strangle Venezuela, suffocate it. There are other practices. Domestically, they've attacked our currency, the bolivar, which is what has provoked hyperinflation and therefore a slump of the purchasing power and a contraction of the economy. This attack on the currency is not new, it's happened before. It's an imperial weapon in this economic war, with some $90 billion of losses in this sense for the government, but for the Venezuelan people as well. So this system of compensation of payments controlled by the federal, Russia, China have developed alternatives. Can Venezuela use that? So we're now prevented from using the SWIFT system of international payments in dollars. So alliances with China and Russia, and China, which is developing the Belt and Road Initiative, which is also developing its own system of payments, Russia as well, to overcome the SWIFT system or avoid the SWIFT system. So the Belt and Road Initiative also includes these new systems of payments. The other BRIC countries, Brazil, South Africa, India, are also developing a BRICS pay system using other currencies. So there's this important confrontation between the hegemony of the United States and the dollar, and China, Russia, and the BRICS, who are developing with the petro, yuan, and gold as a way of being a counterbalance to the hegemony of the dollar. It's not by chance that Venezuela is in the middle of this. Not just geographically is Venezuela in the center, but with the petro, Venezuela has the biggest oil reserves, some of the biggest oil reserves, gold reserves. So it's very much in the center of this geopolitical game. And also the issue of transfers of technology with Russia and China. What is the key to rebuilding the economic and financial fabric? It is possible because Venezuela has a lot of resources. We need to strengthen the bolivar, prevent it from being attacked, and stop this hyperinflation which affects us. We have also some principal reserves of oil and the gold to support, so the bolivar could be backed with gold, but also the use of currency to move to a system of payments which on the United States. This is something which President Chavez began to develop in this direction. And domestically, we need to advance towards technological independence, looking towards the east. Thank you very much, Pascualina, for being with us. So let's go to our conclusions.
Bueno, quienes quieren acabar con la revolución bolivariana
those who want to
en la
destroy the
oralidad,
Bolivarian
es decir, en el
revolution,
discurso y en la acción, son cada vez más
in their words
agresivos.
and actions,
La operación propuesta, no obstante, se debilita por
getting
diferencias
more
entre los
aggressive,
distintos grupos de
but
poder,
there are
las
contradictions
élites que
between
están
different
participando y por
groups
errores
of the
de cálculo,
elites,
cuestiones que no han
and
sabido
also by
medir. Voceros de
miscalculations.
Estados Unidos ahora se
Spokespeople of the United
contradicen en si
States
están
now
dispuestos
contradict
o
each
no
other
a
about
concretar
whether
una
they're
agresión militar,
prepared
que
to
por
go
cierto
towards a
tendría
military
dimensiones
aggression
todavía no medidas en el
in
hemisferio occidental.
Venezuela.
Definitivamente Venezuela
So,
sí es espacio
Venezuela
geoestratégico
is a
en el cual se dirimen nudos
strategic
críticos y
space
contradicciones geopolíticas en
where
este presente. Y las
geopolitical
sanciones, como
contradictions
decía
are
nuestra
playing
invitada
out.
Pascualina Curcio, son crímenes de lesa humanidad.
And
Hay
as
hechos que demuestran
Pascualina
que
said,
efectivamente tienen
sanctions
una
involve
funcionalidad
crimes
política
against
que responden a un
humanity
chantaje
which
y a la
have
obsesión de pretender un cambio
a
de gobierno
political
cuando este haya sido electo
dimension
popularmente.
trying to
Es la hora de
overthrow
ratificar convocatorias al respeto del derecho internacional y en una
legitimately
frase de Fernando Bonavarte
elected
rescato que
government.
incluyó
We
en
need
esta
to
parte
reaffirm
conclusiva de nuestra jugada
the
crítica.
rule of
Como
international
siempre,
law.
gracias por acompañarnos.
Thank
Sigue
you
en
for being
sintonía
with
de
us.
Telesur. Hasta pronto.
We come to the end of Critical Moves.